Hello. So this is what I promised to do would be just to record the kind of lecture part of our seminar, or basically where I give you kind of, where I do most of the talking, let's be honest, where there isn't that much case for feedback unless you have questions, which of course just write down and ask at the beginning of class on Wednesday. So in this lecture now, we went from kind of various theorists of pandemics. This is going to introduce you to the broad field of comparative pandemics, or what is called epidemiology, combining the word for the muse of history with the study of epidemics. And really, this is going to teach you kind of what are the historical issues in treating epidemics, and particularly how do we analyze popular media making sense of all the pandemics of the past. And of course, the media has an interest in making sense of the pandemics of the past to enlighten us about coronavirus in the present. And then once we do this lecture, then we're going to zoom in on particular pandemics, and particularly why do they have such a hold on our imagination? So let us begin. Very good. So as I said, this is our lecture on the issues of epidemiology. And really, what are the two overarching themes of this information part of our seminar? Number one, what constitutes comparative pandemics? And number two, what history lessons do we draw from past pandemics? And of course, this touches upon a major debate in history. Shall we leave events in the past and study them for their own sake? Or should we draw upon lessons for our present? And we'll see kind of the ramifications and manifestations of this debate as we proceed. So let's look at previous pandemics, such as the Ebola outbreak. 5 lessons we should have learned from pandemics. And you can see this article is 5 years old. But the person who wrote this article, so this is 2015 in response to the Ebola outbreak. And notice at the end of the article, what lecture is he giving? Pandemics, can we learn the lessons of history? There is one phrase that historians cringe at. Those who are doomed, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Because of course that suggests a notion of historical determinism, that the past determines the present without giving kind of agency to actors in the present. Well, let us debate this, or let us debate this when we actually meet, but let's see how I deal with this topic. But you see, even prior to COVID-19, there were calls to kind of take the lessons from past pandemics and apply them for the future. If we can say bluntly, did we learn the lessons from COVID-19? From Ebola? Definitely not in terms of biosecurity preparedness. And then you see right in the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, okay, this is very early. Jeremy Browns is one of the experts, and you're going to be reading about him on the Spanish flu. And this article was assigned to you, is what past crises tell us about the coronavirus. So in other words, there's a difference between suggesting history is kind of cyclical, that history determines the present, but none, in other words, or let's say predetermines the present. But in terms of change in continuity, where is the continuity that Jeremy Brown identifies? Overreaction, overconfidence, and confusion. So you get an idea of what the various media are trying to do. In other words, they're, of course, in the age of digitalism, they're trying to inform, but at the end of the day, they also have to generate what's called clickbait, okay? And that, of course, lessons learned as a headline is a good way to generate the so-called clickbait. Okay, let's look at some more examples. Not necessarily dealing with history per se, but art history. What can we learn from the art of pandemics past? Now, in this case, I learned something, for example, even though I've studied pandemics, but what is the New York Times doing here? Okay, I didn't know Gustav Klimt and Munch, all these kind of famous turn of the century artists had endured the Spanish flu, for example. This is a Gustav Klimt image, self-portrait after surviving the flu. And then we have even history addressed by the tech magazine, Wired. History of pandemics teaches us only that we can't be taught. So this is there a lesson in this repeating failure? What would we even learn if there was? Okay, so this goes back to kind of the trope of learning the lessons of history. But this article is a bit more complex. I didn't assign it because really the point of the article could be summarized with the following screenshot. If the past is prologue, then we are really bad at using the past as prologue. Now, this is really, we're seeing history being addressed to political leaders. Because of course, when we're saying we, who are we referring to as the we that gets us ready for pandemics? Well, it's political leaders and then the public health officials. And of course, this is one of the few articles that reminds us that there is a field called clioepidemiology. And this is what we're doing, describes the practice of studying information from past epidemics for advice about the present. Okay, so let's try this out. Let's all be clioepidemiologists, if you will. Okay, what do charts like this represent? So this is kind of, so in other words, what we're doing, what is, well, what are we saying first of all? It's just a simple chart. I don't know why it isn't perfectly chronological. Why did they put Japanese? Well, I guess there might be, okay, I see what they're doing perhaps. And you see, I can look at this over and over again and still glean new information. I think they're coupling or pairing the diseases. So the Antonine plague and the Japanese smallpox epidemic would be both smallpox, even though it could have been a case of measles. In my kind of historical, just my historical guess, I don't think the Antonine plague was measles. It could have spread, but I don't definitely think it's one or. It's either smallpox just by itself and or measles. Because historically, there's never been a measles epidemic of this magnitude that could cause 5 million deaths. Okay, then she, or whoever made this chart, then pairs the bubonic plagues, plague of Justinian and the Black Death, which is the approach I use. I'm dividing the Black Death into two, plague of Justinian and then Black Death and afterwards. Then we have what's called the Great Dying. The New World smallpox outbreak. That killed about, you can see here, 56 million, but in relative terms, it was about 90% of Latin America's population. The Great Plague of London of 1665. Yeah, you see, in this case, she could have made the Italian plague first. Okay, I get it. They're both, you've seen the person. I don't know why I keep on saying the person who made this is a she, sorry. But look at this. Italy has had an unfortunate history with plagues. And so this is the question, why? The Black Death, that was ground zero of the plague then. Then we have something just called the Italian plague. And where did the plague, the COVID-19 first have a major European epidemic? It was in Italy. And the question is, why Italy, not Poland, for example? Poland was not ravaged by the Black Death. Well, geography does have a play. Think of Italy as a peninsula surrounded by water on three sides and a very good place for ports. And then also remember how plague was carried, usually by ships infested with rats who would be bitten by fleas, who would then go on to infect humans. Great Plague of London, 1665. That's what inspired Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which is, it's written kind of like an autobiography. It's the kind of Blair Witch Project of its time. But he actually, it's written as a journal, but it's really a work of fiction that is so real, it appears as nonfiction. And then look at this, cholera pandemics 1 through 6. In other words, over 100 years. Now, Yersinia pestis and cholera are both bacteria. And that Yersinia pestis was transmitted by flies and lice. Those are when we call the animal that's transferring the virus or bacterium, that's called the vector. Cholera didn't have a vector. It was, in theory, humans were the vector. One drank polluted water, let's say in the Ganges Delta, and then one traveled. And then if one kind of excreted the bacteria and, well, sewage, there was no such thing as sewage in the early 1800s. Let's say if you're in Russia and excreted the bacterium, you polluted water wells in Russia, then cholera breaks out there. And then it's the same story how it travels to London. In other words, how did a plague, a bacteria that emerged in the rivers of India travel such distances? It was really a pandemic of the steamship. The third bubonic plague, that more or less began in China and really, yeah, as the chart says, ravaged India. Then we have yellow fever, late 1800s. There is a reason why the nation's capital of the US is not in Philadelphia and is in Washington, DC. One of the rationales was to get away from the yellow fever outbreaks of Philadelphia. Now, keep in mind, in those days, they didn't know mosquitoes were the vectors of yellow fever, never mind malaria. And unfortunately, by building the national capital in a swamp, where there's plenty of mosquitoes, wasn't the solution to the problem. I mean, the streets were built a bit more wide out, there was a bit more space, and in theory that gives less space and crowded inhabitation for mosquitoes to bite, but it wasn't the solution. Russians flew 1889 to 1890. It's called the Russian flu, but it also went global. One theory, and keep in mind it's a theory because history of diseases is quite tricky in terms of we depend on primary sources, and not all historians agree on what's the causative agent of the disease. See the Antonine plague, still a debate, smallpox or measles. The Russian flu, now here's a hypothesis. Began in Russia, spread throughout Europe, eventually reached the US. It could have given a generation immunity to the Spanish flu. Now think about this, the Spanish flu did not kill the elderly. It killed mostly the young. And one theory was they had been exposed to, the elderly had already been exposed to an influenza. If they lived, they had immunity, and thus were much more able to withstand than the Spanish flu that comes when say 1918, and you could do the math and you could see how anyone who lived through Russia's flu would be more immune to the Spanish flu. And there we go. It's a virus that we believe, so the thing about influenza viruses usually emerge from wild bird life, ducks, that usually either then go on to infect a pig, the virus mutates, and then it goes on to infect a human. And then let's see what happens. So when you see the H1N1s or anything with HN, that is influenza. That refers to the structure. It's not a coronavirus with the crowns, okay? So in other words, let's just go back. Oh, sorry. H2N2 was the Russian flu, right? It never went away. It reemerged in the 1950s again. Okay. Same with H1N1. What happened? It just ravaged a population. Those who it couldn't kill, it didn't kill. And then what happens? Reemerges. In other words, the virus most likely didn't go anywhere. It reemerges in 2009, sorry, as a swine flu. But by this time, not as virulent because, number one, still killed a lot of people. Well, antibiotics have been invented, and antibiotics usually kill the most dangerous part of the influenza, not the virus, but the bacterial infections that are a secondary symptom. Then what happens? The Hong Kong flu and you see, this was before the WHO kind of institute measures not to call a virus by the place it emerged. All right. So we see the various flus, and what do we have? HIV/AIDS began 1981. Now, I should say, as a historian, 1981 is when it went pandemic. As far as we know, in the 1920s, HIV began as an epidemic in Cameroon and Kinshasa, which was known as Leopoldville, in what was known then as the Belgian Congo. What happened then? Somewhere in the jungles of the Belgian Congo, it was mostly believed that workers, day laborers building a railroad, of course, it's common practice to consume bushmeat. And of course, when you're building a railroad, what does that mean? You're cutting down virgin forests. And in other words, you're going to be now consuming bush meat that for most of human history has been isolated from any human contact. And when the chimpanzees in these jungles were infected with a virus called SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus. Okay. SIV, it was just an unfortunate accident while butchering bushmeat, okay? That SIV entered a human, and it would have entered a human through probably a cut on the human. Now imagine if you're butchering a monkey, that, you know, it's not an easy process. And if you're doing this a lot, you probably have cuts on your skin, okay? And then SIV mutated to become HIV. The minute it mutated in a human now, the thing is when the virus mutation occurs, then it could, or a bacterial mutation, it could then transfer or become infectious through a different route. You see, SIV is something else. The minute it entered a human, HIV is then transmitted through sexual contact or the transfusion of bloods via uncleansed needles. That probably happened in the 1920s, just it was never diagnosed as a separate virus. And of course, if you're not diagnosing it properly, then what is it doing? It's spreading in Africa in the 1920s, in that particular area of Africa, and then boom, air travel from Africa to Haiti, from Haiti to the US by 1981. It's now become a pandemic. Okay. Again, why put the swine flu before SARS? And if you're going to combine the viruses, okay, so you see there are some problems. Well, that's what we're going to study about, kind of the way you do, how we get the numbers and visualize it. SARS and MERS, okay, so Ebola should be separated from SARS, MERS, and COVID-19 if we're classifying the infection. SARS, MERS, and COVID-19, they're all, as the chart says, coronaviruses. And you can see they were so deadly that they never, their hosts never lived long enough to spread it. And basically, what do all these viruses have in common? They force your immune system to go into overdrive, damaging your respiratory system. They're usually caught via your respiratory system, eyes, nose, mouth. Ebola, on the other hand, is not a respiratory-borne virus. Usually you have to come into direct contact with the vector. In this case, this wave of Ebola, so Ebola had been around since the 70s. It's named after a particular place in Africa where it was discovered. In 2014, a young boy in a village recently built in a recently cleared jungle was playing with some bats, got infected. And usually you have to be in close contact with the body of the infected to catch the Ebola virus. Okay. So that's what a chart does, flawed as it is. But then what we're going to see here is basically counting the dead. This is what clioepidemiology is about. It's macabre. It's macabre, but you can even see within this discussion. It's surreal. It is kind of like a necro history, if you will. But you do this to generate lessons, comparative lessons about the past. Okay, what about this, which is this site called Ranker. And weird history, you can't get more popular historical memory than that. Now, this is something that copies BuzzFeed. It's kind of mimicking BuzzFeed. And what would Marshall McLuhan say of a website like this? First of all, if you go to the site, I kind of copied and pasted. I said, this is hyperreality. Look how hard it is for me to get the information. I have a pop-up screen. I have another ad for Oxygen. It's a cell phone provider. Another ad for gambling, okay? And then I get for the information. That's definitely hyperreality. What would Marshall McLuhan say about a website like this? Fascination with death. This is the question. Why are a lot of these articles dealing with pandemics of interest to us? Well, okay, there has to be some kind of societal fascination with death. In other words, what would Marshall McLuhan say of an article like this? Death sells. Death and disease sells. Okay. And what else? Diseases can be ranked. Death can be quantified. Now, with all popular historical memories, sometimes you get these nuggets if you dig, and you literally have to dig through all the ads. Okay. This is my favorite, and it did lead me on the trail to a very good primary source from this author, describing the, well, I mean, I shouldn't say it's my favorite. It's very, of course, an awful subject. There were so many bodies being buried, one on top of the other, like layers of cheese in a lasagna. And you can, what an Italian metaphor. I mean, you can't get more Italian than that. Anyway, you gotta laugh sometimes at these horrible subjects. Okay. Now, compare that to something that is a very sophisticated digital history provided by the Washington Post Retropolis site, okay? Where not only do you have, I mean, very good images of art, art of pandemics past, okay? And go ahead to that hyperlink if you want on your own. But I've broken down, if I'm not mistaken, I copied and pasted the textual information. Because you do have to admit, sometimes, even though it's well done, you know, it's a good digital history product, sometimes it can be overwhelming. Sometimes you want the text as a separate piece just to get the information. But again, it's the same process, though, essentially, of ranking death. They have a, of course, again, just some of the kind of very good art that they put of kind of the dislocation caused by yellow fever. What I like is, see the previous list that we had before. Sometimes the way you visualize a pandemic can make you see past pandemics in a different light. Okay. Because look at the plague of Justinian and think 30 to 50 million. Now, when you compare them to, let's say, the Black Death centuries later, and you think about it, jump up to 75 million, that's 25 million difference. But then if you think, now this is always a problem because in infographics like this, you'll have no comparison to the world population or in terms of percentage of deaths. But if you think the plague of Justinian or the first bubonic plague we're going to study, that was a significant amount of the world's population. Black Death, look at the range of numbers. And sometimes you need a graphic like this just to show you how varied the numbers are. And that's what the jobs of historians are, is always to go back and kind of revise the numbers. One debate that I particularly follow is the New World tally of deaths. And again, wide discrepancy from 25 to 55 million. And historians, yeah, keep on debating the particular numbers. Then you see by the 18th, okay, Italian plague now looks small, but then you have to look in kind of from the perspective of those in Italy. It was kind of a Mad Max sort of apocalypse. Again, the third plague, 12 million might not seem a lot. The world population is much larger. For people in India and China, it definitely seems a lot. Then let's go to the next part. Okay, then we have the Spanish flu. Again, not as bad as past pandemics, okay? But still for the 20th century, at least for that short period of time, 1918 to 1920, in other words, it had 3 waves. And then it puts kind of HIV/AIDS also in perspective. Okay. Around the same amounts of death, but kind of spread out, if you will. Okay. Then let's look, what does a graph like this teach us? But before I do that, I want to go to 2 videos. Okay? And I want you to compare the job that these 2 videos do. Okay? So basically taking a timeline and maybe asking the questions that I said are missing. What was the percentage of the world's population at that time? So let's go to the first one. Just setting up here. Oh, you're so slow. Oh. Okay, watch the first. All right. Okay. First of all, what did I like about that video? I like how they showed actually the active, okay, actually, no, there was a fault. I like how they showed the shape of each pathogen, but you also have to keep in mind, they have them all kind of laid out on these tables, but if a virus is like this, a bacterium would be the size of this entire room. I mean, you can't compare the sizes, but nevertheless, okay, they got the shape. What I didn't like was, again, what a bizarre choice of music. Okay, in other words, this is kind of digital history, but in the beginning, I don't know what kind of music was that, how to describe that. You know when your parents went to sleep and you watched soft porn on Showtime? I'm not, I don't know where that came from. Okay, and I'm not going to record this again. So let's use that metaphor. But yeah, that was kind of the music that accompanies soft porn. And then, like, once COVID comes, you have this like waltzy march. Anyway, let's compare that to the next video that. Well, let's just compare them. Let me just skip the ad. All right. Now again, just look at this title, 20 Deadliest Pandemics in History. Why 20? Surely there must be 21. In other words, again, what would Marshall McLuhan say about this? This is kind of the ranking of death, but we like round numbers. So, okay, it's 20 instead of 19, or, I mean, did they look really hard to get that 20th? Anyway. It's March 24th, 2020. So also that's to keep in mind, because even these videos are in a sense historical documents in and of themselves, and that the coronavirus deaths that they report are going to be way out of date. So not BuzzFeed, but the buzz.
Throughout history, as humans spread across the globe, infectious diseases have become a constant companion. Even as I speak, we are living through an outbreak. Today, we will be selecting 20 deadliest diseases in human history with the exact year and timeline of each disease's caused, and we will not include the ones before the current era, the Christian era, or the BC, so let's dive right into the timeline. At number 20, the Antonine Plague. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD, also known as the Plague of Galen, was an ancient pandemic brought to the Roman Empire by troops returning from campaigns in the Near East. The Greek physician described symptoms common to smallpox and measles, and the loss of lives were incredible. The total deaths have been estimated at 5 million, and the disease killed as much as 1/3 of the Roman population. At number 19, the Plague of Justinian. A pandemic that afflicted the Roman Empire, port cities around the entire Mediterranean Sea, as merchant ships harbored rats that carried fleas infected with plague. In 2013, researchers confirmed the earlier speculation that the cause of the Plague of Justinian was a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. The Plague of Justinian was one of the deadliest pandemics in history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 30 to 50 million people during 2 centuries of recurrence, and a total death equivalent to as much as half of Europe's population at that time. At number 18, the Japanese smallpox epidemic. It was a major smallpox epidemic that afflicted much of Japan, and the virus that caused it was variola virus. Over 2 million people died due to this outbreak, and approximately 1/3 of the entire Japanese population. At number 17, the Black Death. Also known as the Great Bubonic Plague, similar to the Plague of Justinian due to the same bacterium Yersinia pestis. The bubonic plague first emerged in China more than 2,600 years ago and arrived in Europe in October 1347. The disease then spread towards Western Europe and then to Africa. The plague killed
I knew nothing at all about working in front of a camera.
I graduated from college and really felt lost.
I had an agent And he just looked at me and he
What
said,
would Marshall
"You're never
McLuhan
gonna
say
make
of
it
an
in
ad
stand-up.
just interrupting the history of
You don't
death?"
have to get it right.
Well, anyway.
Killed an estimated 25 million people, almost a third of the continent's population. At number 16, the smallpox of Aztec. Aztec civilization spanned between 1345 to 1520 AD in what is now Mexico. It was brought to Mexico by those in Spanish ships, then spread to the center of Mexico. It was an unknown disease not only in Mexico but in the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans, and it was introduced to Mexican lands by the Spanish and played a significant role in the downfall of the Aztec Empire. The estimated death of the smallpox between 1519 to 1520 AD was about 5 to 8 million people. At number 15, the Great Plague of London. It was the last major epidemic of the bubonic plague to occur in England, and it happened within the centuries-long time period of the second pandemic, an extended period of intermittent bubonic plague epidemics which originated in China in 1331, the first year of the Black Death and outbreak, which included other forms of pneumonic plague and lasted until 1750. It was the third plague caused by Yersinia pestis bacterium, which is usually transmitted through the bite of an infected rat flea. The Great Plague killed about 100,000 people in London. At number 14, the Great Plague of 1738. The Great Plague of 1738 was an outbreak of the bubonic plague between 1738 to 1740 that affected areas in the modern nations of Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Serbia, Croatia, and Austria. Although no exact figure is available, the epidemic likely killed over 50,000 people. At number 13, the cholera pandemic of 1817 to 1824. The first known pandemic of cholera originated in the Ganges River Delta in India. The disease broke out near Calcutta and spread through the rest of the country, but the death toll from this outbreak is not known, but based on the 10,000 recorded deaths among British troops, researchers estimated that hundreds of thousands across India succumbed to the disease. In 1820, 100,000 people died on the Indonesian island of Java alone. At number 12, the Third Plague Pandemic, 1855. The Third Plague Pandemic was a major bubonic plague pandemic that began in Yunnan, China in 1855 during the 5th year of the Xianfeng Emperor of the Qing dynasty. This episode of bubonic plague spread to all inhabited continents and ultimately led to more than 12 million deaths in India and China, with about 10 million killed in India alone. At number 11, the yellow fever. The virus originated in Africa and was brought to the Western Hemisphere during the slave trade era, with the first epidemic reported in 1648 in the Yucatan. Over the ensuing 200 years, outbreaks occurred widely in tropical America, the North American coastal cities, and Europe. The disease is caused by yellow fever virus and is spread by the bite of an infected female mosquito, and the yellow fever killed more than 100,000 people. At number 10, the 1889 to 1890 flu pandemic. The flu pandemic of 1889 to 1890 was a deadly influenza pandemic, and the outbreak was dubbed Russian flu. Reanalysis of seroarchaeological data has indicated that influenza A subtype H3 is the most likely cause for the 1889 to 1890 pandemic. This pandemic killed about 1 million people worldwide. At number 9, the Spanish flu pandemic 1918 to 1920 AD. The Spanish flu, also known as the 1980 flu pandemic, was an unusually deadly influenza pandemic lasting from January 1918 to December 1920. It infected 500 million people, about a quarter of the world's population at that time. The death toll is estimated to have been anywhere from 17 million to 50 million and possibly as high as 100 million, making it one of the deadliest epidemics in human history. At number 8 is Asian flu. The Asian flu of 1957, also called the Asian flu pandemic of 1957, is an outbreak of influenza that was first identified in February 1957 in East Asia and subsequently spread to countries worldwide. The 1957 Asian flu was the second major influenza pandemic to occur in the 20th century after the Spanish flu and preceded the Hong Kong flu pandemic of the 1968. The Asian flu outbreak caused an estimated 1 million to 2 million deaths worldwide and is generally considered to have been the least severe of the three influenza pandemics of the 20th century. At number 7, the Hong Kong flu of 1968. The Hong Kong flu was a Category 2 flu pandemic whose outbreak in 1968 and 1969 killed an estimated 1 million people all over the world. It was caused by a H3N2 strain of the influenza A virus descended from H2N2 through antigenic shift, a genetic process in which genes from multiple subtypes reassorted to form a new virus. At number 6 is HIV. The origin of the human immunodeficiency virus has been a subject of scientific research and debate since the virus was identified in the 1980s. HIV crossed from chimps to humans in the 1920s, and the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, is a virus that attacks the immune system, specifically the CD4 cells or T cells. According to WHO, 75 million people have been infected with the HIV virus, and about 32 million people have died. At number 5 is SARS coronavirus. Severe acute respiratory syndrome virus was identified in 2003. SARS-CoV is thought to be an animal virus from an as yet uncertain animal reservoir, perhaps bats that spread to other animals and first infected humans in the Guangdong province of southern China in 2002. The SARS pandemic was eventually brought.
Not again.
I have always felt if you know what you're going to do.
Brought under control in 2003, and during the period of infection, there were 8,098 reported cases of SARS and 774 deaths. At number 4, the swine flu of 2009. It was an influenza pandemic that lasted from January 2009 to August 2010, and the second of the two pandemics involving H1N1 influenza virus. About 150,000 to 575,000 fatalities were recorded. At number 3, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome 2012. It was a new killer respiratory disease caused by MERS coronavirus, first reported from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in September 2012. The total number of laboratory-confirmed MERS-CoV infected cases reportedly globally to WHO is 2,519 with 866 associated deaths. At number 2, the Ebola virus 2014 to 2016. Ebola virus causes an acute serious illness which is often fatal if untreated. Ebola virus disease is caused by infection with Ebola virus, and about 11,315 people have been reported as having died from the disease in 6 countries: Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, the US, and Mali. At number 1 is coronavirus disease 2020. It is an infectious disease caused by a newly discovered coronavirus, and most people infected with the COVID-19 virus will experience mild to moderate respiratory illness and recover without requiring special treatment. Older people and those with underlying medical problems like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, and cancer are more likely to develop serious illness. As of today, 13,671 deaths have been reported. Best way to prevent and slow down transmission is to be well informed about the COVID-19 virus, the disease it causes, and how it spreads. Protect yourself and others from infection by washing your hands or using an alcohol-based rub frequently, and by not touching your face. So guys, like we've done in the past, and let's make it our utmost priority to stay safe and do follow all the rules laid down by the government, and let's fight this together.
Look at this, what comes up. What next? Top 10 pistols in the world, top type of Indian tanks, top deadliest and most powerful cruise missiles, actually, which I need to watch. That's for a different research project. Not for you guys. And then the various ads for Kill the Goblin. Okay, again, disease in the age of hyperreality. And what is it about our phenomena that we just like to rank things? I mean, if you go to the History Channel, they have entire 1-hour programs on the top 10, such and such, you know? It's again, something that we have to consider. This is, of course, an academic discipline worthy of study in its own right, but do we see how when it meets popular media, what becomes the study of past suffering becomes something that is ranked. Okay. Now, going back to our lecture. So what about a graph like this? What does this teach us in terms of kind of spatial understanding of past pandemics? So, I mean, again, it's a good introduction to what are the great pandemics of history. Here we go, various outbreaks, Spanish flu, the Russian flu, HIV. Just another way of comparison in terms of deaths, right? But you see, the way, every chart or every graph makes you see a different detail. What do I see here is a reminder to ask you a question, because it's something that I am aware of, but it's a prompt that is not, and again, you can see how early, whether it was that video or this chart, this is just March, and how relatively few deaths there were back in March, 6,000, 34,000, right? Anyhow, there's a question we should be asking. How come there's so many coronaviruses emerging in the 21st century? It is believed that there are, in the history of humanity, 7 coronaviruses that made a zoonotic jump. In other words, a jump from an animal reservoir into humans, even though we are animals. Okay, but let's say a zoonotic jump. So one mammal transferring the virus to us, right? 7? Why is it that 3 coronaviruses had made this jump in the 21st century? This is something we have to ask. And to answer the question, well, this is why I had such a focus on the dynamics of modernity. Modern processes, global integration, global travel networks, expansion of human populations, urban densities, as well as encroachment on forests for natural resources. All of those create the conditions in which we're seeing more zoonotic jumps in the last 20 years than perhaps in the last 2,000 years. And then this site then also kind of gives us not a kind of temporal outline, but in terms of just the fatalities. Serves as a good comparison, because again, you would make connections that you otherwise wouldn't. So Black Death, again, I mean, just in terms of a number, remains the deadliest. But there's also then, for every chart, there's also something missing. Have you noticed some diseases that have been missing from all these charts? Sure, smallpox, these are raging. These are just charts of pandemics. Okay, in other words, diseases that went, forgive the pun, viral over multiple geographical locations. You see what we're missing are what are endemic diseases. Okay, you do have HIV, which is now, so basically what's the distinction? Epidemic is when a disease rages out of control in a geographical area, such as Wuhan, Hubei province. The pandemic emerges when it starts spreading to multiple countries across continents. And then endemic refers to when that disease is not going to go anywhere. It's just part of human life. So in other words, smallpox has been an endemic killer for a lot of history. It killed a lot of people in Central, South, and later North America. But just in the 20th century, okay, so you have to put these numbers. Yeah, Black Death over, just look how little those years are. 1347 to 1351 killed what? Up to an estimated 200 million people. Throughout the span of the 20th century, smallpox might have killed around 300 million people. But you don't, that is harder to graph. Okay, what we want, and you see here kind of the information meets the demands. We want comparisons of pandemics because that's what we're going through. Then there you see HIV, which is in theory, when you see 1981 to the present, it means it's now endemic, right? And then just kind of comparisons. And there you got COVID-19, MERS, and SARS. But again, even this is kind of a revelation that there's a lot of coronaviruses, new or in other words, novel coronaviruses emerging in the 21st century. National Geographic has a very good August 2020. So in other words, this is the digital history. This is print media. And of course, National Geographic, of course, is popular media. And there's things you can do with the digital graph that you can't do with the original version. Well, let's see. And this one is kind of just a bit more in terms of kind of digital history. Sorry, this board's in the way. Okay, let's look at this chart. And so what they do is color-coded. Yellow for epidemics. Here's the definitions, pandemic. And then plague pandemics caused by Yersinia pestis. And of course, we're going to be focusing 2 lectures on just Yersinia pestis. It deserves its own categories in this chart, and it deserves 2 lectures. And then it gives you kind of death toll, virus or bacterium. And it's kind of interactive. You hover, and there it gives you plague of Justinian. And kind of the time span. Okay, so plague of Justinian was 16 years, and you see the Black Death, right? Now, what's missing, again, is third plague pandemic, but it emerged multiple times, okay? So it doesn't have everything. For every chart, there's something missing. Okay, what about this disease that is most likely, oh, come on, sorry. Which is probably in the Howard, Kokolitzli, okay? Again, something that's good for National Geographic, because usually we pay attention to, you know, what are the diseases we know, such as smallpox and how many people it killed. But then it's forgotten that the Central America and South America then went through waves of diseases that still to this day, we're not sure what it is. And then what else does this, you know, you buy the magazine, but then you always, of course, on the newsstand while you're waiting, you buy your groceries, or if you have a subscription. But then they also have these very good graphics. The spread of smallpox. And then look at this. Just 1492, agricultural area controlled by an empire. So here we have the Aztecs and the Incans. And then, yeah, Columbus's first journey. How slavery also served as a vector of disease, as a way of bringing the disease, new diseases to the Americas. And then you see kind of a parallel history, how diseases also, if not traveled with, even precede the conquistadores. And then the deaths. Now keep in mind, when you're seeing the population of the Caribbean, it might not seem a lot in the numbers, but remember in terms of percentage, that's close to 100% of the native population. Okay. And then this kind of gives you a infographic of a expeditionary force, one of the great kind of public health efforts during the age of the Spanish Empire. Okay. In terms of popular history, digital history, this particular issue of National Geographic is quite good, but we have to admit, August 2020, okay. We owe this thing in my hand because of COVID-19. It's COVID-19 that's forcing us to kind of look back in the past to make sense of the present. So going back to that National Geographic issue. At the end, look what this infographic, how they introduce it. And here is an example of this popular media that really gets to the point. This is a scale of suffering, okay? And sometimes this is what gets missed in the way we deal with pandemics in the past. When we rate them, when we rank them, so on and so forth. We fall into the trap of when somebody says, you know, World War II was my favorite war, for example, or I love the Civil War. Something gets missed when we say statements like this. And yeah, I mean, I do teach a class called War and Society where I have students jump up, oh, the Civil War, my favorite. Okay, we got to put these things in perspective. This is a subject that is not only, of course, traumatic for those who died, who lived through them, but it should be traumatic for us as researchers. I know it's traumatic for me to read about this. It's sometimes, you know, I wished I went into kind of a field like history of ideas, just where you're actually studying the ideas of already traumatized philosophers rather than having the past traumatize yourself. But this is a case where, yes, the subject is traumatic. And this is where kind of, okay, you know, good for National Geographic for kind of really summarizing what is the essence of epidemiology. It is studying the scales of suffering. Major epidemics of the modern era. Now, this is produced by the Council of Foreign Relations, so not a kind of historical organization, a popular organization that, just a second, I'll be back. Okay, a popular organization that creates the very popular journal, Foreign Affairs. Now, if you see here, this is when they write the world after the pandemic. Of course, they also create websites like this to see what was the world before the current pandemic, okay? And in this case, major epidemics of the modern era, they choose to begin in 1899. But really, some would argue this is not the major I mean, they're missing some major epidemics of the modern era. Some historians will argue that the Black Death of the 1300s really ushered in at least the early modern state as we know it. Frank Snowden, for example, would be one of those scholars. Okay, so again, even though the Council of Foreign Relations, not a historical organization in terms of being devoted to history per se, but nevertheless, also remember an article I signed you from its president, Richard Haas, who makes the debate that we're not living in a post-COVID-19 world. It's accelerating trends in history rather than representing a rupture. So again, another example of debating the temporality of past pandemics and the present. When we chart history, it doesn't all necessarily have to be negative. Look at death rates for infectious diseases provided by this chart, specifically focusing on the US. Look at the difference of mass-produced penicillin coming on towards the end of World War II, what the difference that made. The Salk vaccine, which ended polio. Okay, this is an awful affliction that particularly affected the young. Or even this chart of, let's see, like a crowded place like New York City and causes of death. If we look here, now let's see them: yellow fever, smallpox, scarlet fever, cholera outbreaks, smallpox again and again, typhus. Not to be mistaken with typhoid fever, they're two different things. And if I'm not mistaken, typhus is a nasty affliction caused by lice. Yeah, not fun. Not that I've had it, but I can't imagine being that fun. Diphtheria, meningitis, all things that we get vaccinated for now. And again, look at the difference of the chlorination of water. What a difference that makes. And then here in terms of, there you have the World Trade Center deaths kind of mapped on this, but in terms of natural pathogens. Again, some charts over history show things to, the progress in terms of the administration of public health. What about this map provided by Lapham's Quarterly? What does it teach us? Well, it takes smallpox, malaria, and leprosy to show us an example of slow pandemics, if you will, or slow diseases that have been endemic throughout the vast big picture of human history. Smallpox origins are 10,000 BC, Northeast Africa. Do you notice, I gotta look this up, Dominican Republic, I don't even know how many numbers. As a historian, I've never had to go back that far in time. Malaria plasmodium is traced to mosquito found in a piece of amber. Wow. Yeah, okay. And even in the history books, I've had trouble finding origins for malaria. Look about it here. What about leprosy? Skin lesions. No, what about the origins of leprosy? East Africa, 40,000 BC. Likely point of origin. And this is, I just find a very interesting kind of a geospatial analysis of the spread of three kind of endemic, well, poxes, if you will. I mean, yeah, smallpox, malaria, which is not caused by a virus nor a bacterium. It's caused by a kind of more full-fledged parasitic organism. Now what we're going to do is, even in cartoons, you could do clioepidemiology. Look at this cartoon. First of all, where are these fellers having a drink at? The rat and bat. Okay. And here you have the coronavirus, Spanish flu. And look what coronavirus is drinking, by the way. And there you have the Black Death. Now keep in mind, that is the infamous plague doctor's uniform, but was not worn during the Black Death of the 1300s. It's a uniform that gets developed much later, centuries later. But what I'm going to do is I want you to watch 3 cartoons provided by National Public Radio prior to the pandemic. Okay? And look at the service NPR does in the following 3 videos. They take basically epidemiology and make it into what I find these very 3 cute cartoons. It's of course a horrid subject, but even then you need, I found these videos kind of great educational tools. And for any future teachers out there, okay, these are, I mean, just a great series of videos that I would recommend. So let's watch just 1 through 3. They're, you know, very short, and like I said, I think they're cute. All right. And it does not only a very good job of studying epidemics in the past, it makes a very prescient prediction about the future.
Humans get along pretty well with most microbes, which is lucky, because there are a lot more of them in the world than there are of us. We couldn't even live without many of them. But a few hundred have evolved, and are still evolving, to exploit our bodies in ways that can make us really sick. These are the microbes we call germs, like plague, HIV, SARS, Ebola, Zika, and a whole gang of others. This is a series about where germs come from. When we Homo sapiens started to evolve as a new species, we inherited many of the microbes that came from our early human ancestors. But many of today's most feared diseases didn't exist yet. Scientists think a lot of these diseases probably came from other animals, like this monkey here. Let's take a closer look at what's happening inside this guy. He happens to be carrying a nasty bug. It's a virus. It's taken control of many of his cells and ordered them to make more copies of itself. But some of these copies aren't exact, and eventually one happens to emerge with an accidental superpower. This superpower monkey virus now has the ability to infect us. It sneaks past our immune system's defenses, gets into our cells, and starts making copies. And then this happens. Luckily, humans were so few and far between back then that this new virus can't find any more humans to infect. That first mutant virus doesn't get very far. But after many thousands of years, something big starts to change. Humans discovered agriculture. This means we start to settle down, cut down the forest to make way for crops, and get comfortable. We start having large families, more neighbors, there's more food. We still like to eat the occasional monkey when we can get our hands on him. But look what happens now.
I win!
No. In nearly every outbreak, some people get lucky and have a mutation or two that helps their bodies defeat the new virus. They move away and maybe build a new settlement.
So, we win?
Not quite. So, oh, right. Our group of disease survivors moved out and started a new settlement. They cleared more land, they planted more seeds, and after a while, they figured out how to tame a handful of wild animals. This was a very exciting development for germs. For the first time in history, humans started living in close contact with other animals, 24/7, milking them, taking care of them, living with them, and eating them. All that touching and sharing gave animal germs plenty of chances to get inside of us. Like measles. Researchers think that up until about 5,000 years ago, it didn't exist, but its older cousin rinderpest, a cattle disease, did. Now that humans were spending so much quality time with cows, little rinderpest germs started jumping over into us, and a few of them had a lucky mutation that allowed rinderpest to evolve from a cattle disease into measles, a deadly human virus. As if that wasn't bad enough, something else was happening right around this time that supercharged the amount of damage this new measles virus could do. There were now a lot more humans around, living much closer together. And when the world's first cities hit the 500,000 mark, that meant measles and other germs could spread from one person to another and never run out of new people to infect, even though they were killing us off at a record pace. Scientists think measles, along with other nasty diseases like mumps, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough, all evolved to live permanently in humans around this time. But our ancestors had no idea what the problem was or how to fix it. One common solution? Run away. But this usually ended up just spreading the new diseases to new people and new places. And the better the roads got, the faster the germs could travel. When people figured out how to sail around the world, the new germs came with them. The results weren't pretty. In the centuries after Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic, some estimates say 90% of the entire native population of the Americas died, mostly from diseases the Europeans brought with them. Not to be outdone, the newly named Americans likely sent syphilis back the other way to wreak havoc on the sex lives of Europeans. So this golden age of discovery was also a golden age for germs. They ruled the high seas and everything in between. They never had it so good until this happened.
Next one. Oh, sorry, guys. You may get a clue.
For most of human history, we had a lot of bad ideas about how we were getting sick. Angry gods, misaligned planets, stinky fumes, and plenty of bad ideas about how to prevent it, like bloodletting, large holes in the head, arsenic. Things started changing only about 200 years ago. An English doctor named Edward Jenner decided to take a closer look at a promising folk remedy. See, milkmaids, they'd get these blisters on their hands, cowpox blisters. People said that if a milkmaid got cowpox, she would never get its deadly cousin smallpox. So our doctor decided to put this milkmaid wisdom to the test. His first step? He wiped gunk from cowpox blisters into a cut he made in the arm of his gardener's 8-year-old son, James Phipps. Sorry, James. James got better pretty quickly because cowpox is usually mild in humans. Then, the doctor made his bold and risky move. He injected James with the similar but deadly smallpox. James didn't get sick. The milkmaid cure had worked. And with that, Jenner invented vaccination. Here's how it works. When you inject weaker germs into our bodies, our immune system takes care of the problem and stays on the lookout for similar-looking germs. So when the really bad guys come, we're ready for them. This was our first safe and effective way to fight disease. About time! After that, things started happening fast. Over the next 150 years, researchers from all over the world joined this fight against germs, discovering them, developing vaccines, killing bacteria with antiseptics and antibiotics. So what did that do for us? Consider that in 1900, the average person lived only about 30 years. Today, most of us live to 70. We were so successful in such a short time. In 1967, the U.S. Surgeon General reportedly exclaimed that we had closed the book on infectious disease. But the truth is more complicated. See what happened way back in episodes 1 and 2, when humans were cutting down forests and catching new germs from wild animals? That's still happening, but now it's on a scale our ancestors never could have imagined. We've cleared about half of our planet's arable land, and we're still cutting. Remember, these wild places are where undiscovered germs live. By getting rid of their homes, we're forcing them to find new ones near us. And there are more of us than ever living closely with animals. Throw in some planes, and the next thing you know, a new germ can turn into a worldwide pandemic practically overnight. Think SARS, HIV, Ebola, bird flu, Zika. These are just some of the viruses plaguing us right now. And we haven't even mentioned antibiotic resistance. So the story continues. Some scientists say the next chapter is us looking for ways we can live together with germs. Germs in their homes and us in ours. Let's just hope our big brains keep working overtime so we find a way to stay one step ahead of that nasty bunch of fast-changing, human-killing microbes, the germs.
And of course, we know the answer to this NPR video. We didn't stay one step ahead of those nasty germs. Okay? In other words, even a video like this just shows you the basic science of epidemics and what the past absolutely does offer in terms of a lesson for the present and the future. In other words, some politicians argued nobody could have seen COVID-19 coming. Okay, what does history tell us? History was warning us that yes, absolutely there was a potential of another coronavirus emerging. Okay. So look at this article that yours truly wrote. Right? So definitely I do belong to the school where I do believe viruses offer lessons. I'm sorry, past pandemics offer lessons for the present, whether it's Black Plague teaching us how effective quarantines are. Spanish flu teaching us the need for a free media to report on health matters, both domestically and abroad. And smallpox teaching us the need for a international cooperation between nations to eradicate viruses. There is one major mistake in this article. See if you catch that. And that was sometimes when the editor writes in some lines in an article. So we'll see if you could catch something I didn't write, but the editor did. And then what else from the past do we use now in our imagination of past pandemics? Well, kind of this apocalyptic imagery from Peter Bruegel, okay? This is the original primary source. Here is it making it into the secondary sources that deals with pandemics past. Again, more pandemic art is definitely, or we could say pestilence art, definitely making it into kind of the public history articles dealing with past pandemics. Okay. I'll pause, I'll conclude here. Okay. We'll be discussing this next article when we meet online. And thank you very much.